January 1945, Eastern Europe. Dawn arrives without warmth. Snow lies pressing the ground like ash, hardened by boots, wheels, and weeks of passing armies. A low wind moves through the ruins of a village, whose name no longer matters. Roofs are gone. Windows are empty. Somewhere beneath the frost, bread once rose in ovens. Now there's only silence, broken by the distant rumble of artillery. Slow, methodical, unhurried. The sound does not signal a battle. It signals inevitability. Across the continent, men in uniform wake to another day of movement, orders, and survival. Civilians wake to hunger, sickness, and absence. Trains still run. Factories still burn through the night. Paper maps still mark objectives in red and blue. Yet beneath the machinery of war, something older has been unleashed. Forces that do not negotiate, do not pause, and do not distinguish between soldier and child. War is no longer an event. It is a condition. And in this winter, the world is not merely fighting. It is being revealed. The path to this moment did not begin in the snow of 1945. It began years earlier, when nations chose to follow powers they believed they could control. The world that moved toward this winter did not believe it was summoning catastrophe. It believed it was correcting injustice. The years after First World War were defined not by peace, but by exhaustion. Empires had collapsed, currencies had withered, and borders were drawn with ink that could not contain the resentment beneath it. Across Europe and Asia, populations lived with a memory of hunger and humiliation. Governments promised restoration. Ideologies promised order. And for a time, many believed them. In Germany, the Treaty of Versailles was not remembered as a diplomatic settlement, but as a wound. Industrial capacity existed, but dignity did not. Unemployment rose into the millions. Political violence became ordinary. Into this vacuum stepped a movement that offered clarity where there had been chaos, identity where there had been fragmentation, and purpose where there had been despair. The promise was simple. The nation would rise again, disciplined, unified, and unchallenged. Few asked what such unity would demand. In Japan, a different pressure built. The island nation had industrialized rapidly, but remained dependent on imported resources, oil, steel, food. Military leaders concluded that survival required expansion. China became both opportunity and battleground. By the late 1930s, war was no longer debated. It was assumed. The logic was framed as necessity, not ambition. Control meant security. Conquest meant stability. The human cost was considered secondary, if it was considered at all. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched with distance and restraint. Scarred by the losses of the previous war and consumed by economic depression, American policy leaned toward isolation. Factories slowed. Farms struggled. Bread lines formed in cities that had once symbolized abundance. Democracy itself appeared fragile. Yet even in hardship, the structure endured. Elections were held. Institutions bent, but did not break. The nation would not yet enter the storm, but it would eventually shape how the storm was survived. By 1939, the machinery was in motion. Germany invaded Poland with a combination of speed, coordination, and industrial force unseen in previous conflicts. Armored columns advanced as aircraft darkened the sky. The concept of total war, where civilian infrastructure, food supply, and morale became legitimate targets, was no longer theoretical. It was operational doctrine. War did not pause at front lines. It spread outward, consuming railways, power stations, and granaries. Britain stood alone for a year, surviving through air defense, rationing, and endurance. Bread was measured. Meat was scarce. Sugar became a memory. Yet the state organized scarcity with intention. Ration books replaced market chaos. Hunger was managed, not ignored. This distinction would later matter more than many realized. As the conflict widened, famine followed close behind. In occupied territories, food was seized, redirected, or allowed to rot based on strategic value. In Eastern Europe, millions were fed according to racial hierarchy. In Asia, civilian populations were stripped of grain to support advancing armies. Disease followed displacement. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis moved faster than supply lines. Pestilence required no ideology to function. It needed only density, weakness, and neglect. By 1941, the final restraint collapsed. Germany turned east, launching the largest invasion in human history. Japan turned south and east, striking across the Pacific. The United States entered the war not as a crusade, but as a response to attack, to threat, to the realization that distance no longer protected democracy. Factories that had once produced cars and refrigerators began to produce aircraft, tanks, and canned food in quantities that altered the mathematics of war. The four horsemen were no longer symbolic. They were measurable. War in divisions and tonnage, famine and caloric intake, pestilence and infection rates, death in columns of numbers that grew too large to comprehend. What followed would not simply determine who won. It would determine how the world understood power itself. As the war expanded, it ceased to be fought only by armies. It was fought by entire societies, reorganized down to the smallest detail. Governments learned quickly that victory no longer depended solely on courage or generalship. It depended on production, logistics, and endurance. The battlefield stretched from factory floors to farmland, from shipping lanes to hospital wards. The distinction between frontline and home front dissolved. In Germany, the economy was bent fully toward war. By 1942, nearly half of all industrial output was devoted to military production. Armaments Minister Albert Speer streamlined factories, standardized designs, and extended work hours. Output increased even as Allied bombs fell nightly. But this efficiency carried a cost that could not be sustained. Millions of foreign laborers were transported into the Reich, many under coercion, many under brutal conditions. Food allocations followed racial categories. German civilians received more. Forced laborers received less. In camps and occupied zones, starvation was not a failure of planning. It was policy. In the Soviet Union, survival demanded sacrifice on a scale that bordered on the unimaginable. Entire industries were dismantled and moved east, beyond the reach of German aircraft. Workers lived inside factories through winter, sleeping beside machines. Cities like Leningrad endured siege not for weeks or months, but for years. Daily bread rations fell to as little as 125 grams. People boiled wallpaper paste for sustenance. Disease spread through weakened bodies. Yet the state did not collapse. The cost was staggering, measured in millions of lives, but resistance held. Japan pursued a different form of total war. Expansion across Southeast Asia aimed to secure oil, rubber, and rice, but the logistics of empire strained the nation's capacity. Merchant shipping could not keep pace with military demand. American submarines slowly severed supply lines. By 1944, urban Japanese civilians faced severe shortages. Malnutrition became widespread. The government urged endurance and spiritual resolve, but calories could not be replaced by ideology. Pestilence followed hunger, and morale thinned alongside bodies. The United States entered this landscape with advantages that were neither accidental nor purely moral. Its territory was untouched by invasion. Its agricultural base was vast. Its industrial capacity, once mobilized, proved unmatched. By 1943, American factories were producing tens of thousands of aircraft per year. Shipyards launched a new cargo vessel every few days. Food production exceeded domestic needs. Soldiers carried canned meat, powdered milk, chocolate, and coffee across oceans. These items were ordinary at home. Abroad, they became symbols. To enemy soldiers and civilians alike, American abundance appeared almost unreal. Prisoners of war recorded shock at regular meals. In camps holding German soldiers, daily rations often exceeded what civilians received in the collapsing Reich. Bread was coarse but consistent. Soup was thin but present. Disease still existed, but mass starvation did not. The contrast was not lost on those who experienced it. For many, it raised questions that propaganda could no longer silence. By late 1944, the war's trajectory was clear, even if its end was not. The four horsemen had ridden across continents, leaving burned cities, emptied villages, and graveyards without names. Yet in their wake, something else moved as well, a demonstration of how systems, values, and choices shaped who starved, who endured, and who survived. These realities would soon collide directly, not in theory, but in lived experience, as the war reached its decisive moments. The human angle of this war was not found in speeches or communiques. It was found in the ordinary moments that continued despite collapse. Soldiers on every side carried the same private expectations into the conflict. Many German conscripts believed they were entering a campaign of speed and superiority, shaped by early victories and relentless propaganda. They expected movement dominance and resolution. What they encountered instead was delay, hunger, and an expanding sense of isolation. By 1943, letters intercepted by censors spoke less of ideology and more of food, cold, and fatigue. The war had narrowed. Survival replaced conviction. Civilians experienced a harsher reckoning. In occupied Europe, normal life became a negotiation with scarcity. Food determined movement. Bread determined loyalty. A loaf could be worth more than currency. In the Netherlands during the winter of 1944, daily caloric intake in some cities fell below 1,000 calories. People dismantled furniture for fuel. Children stopped growing. Hunger erased abstraction. It reduced politics to body. The horsemen of famine did not arrive suddenly. It settled in quietly, week by week. From the enemy perspective, the image of the United States contradicted years of indoctrination. German and Japanese propaganda portrayed Americans as decadent, soft, and undisciplined. Yet encounters with American units revealed something else. Soldiers well-fed, consistently supplied, and medically supported. Field hospitals were stocked. Rations were predictable. Even under fire, logistics held. For prisoners of war, this contrast was impossible to ignore. Diaries and post-war interviews repeatedly noted the same detail. Not ideology, not weapons, but food. Regular meals became a point of fixation, a quiet admission that material reality carried its own authority. Tactically, this abundance translated into endurance. American units could remain in position longer, recover faster, and rotate personnel with greater flexibility. Equipment losses were replaced. Ammunition shortages were rare. Where Axis forces conserved shells and fuel, Allied forces planned around availability. This imbalance altered decision-making on the ground. Battles were no longer contests of bravery alone, but of sustained capacity. The horsemen of war had become industrial, and it favored those who could feed it. Yet beneath these contrasts ran a moral tension. Total war demanded participation, whether one believed or not. Civilians labored in factories that would be bombed. Farmers produced crops that might be requisitioned or destroyed. Soldiers advanced knowing that villages lay in their path. The line between necessity and cruelty blurred. Each system justified itself as essential. Each claimed inevitability. But lived experience, hunger versus sufficiency, sickness versus care, began to erode the certainty of those claims. These pressures did not break all at once. They accumulated angle by angle, until belief itself became unstable, setting the stage for a reckoning that would arrive not as revelation, but as collision. The technological angle of the war revealed a truth that ideology could not obscure. Machines did not respond to belief. They responded to fuel, maintenance, and replacement. The Axis powers entered the conflict with advanced designs and experienced crews, but their systems were fragile under prolonged strain. German tanks were formidable, yet complex. Aircraft were powerful, yet costly to produce and difficult to repair. As shortages deepened, a single disabled vehicle could become irreplaceable. Technology, once a symbol of superiority, became a liability when abundance vanished. American and Allied technology followed a different philosophy. Designs favored standardization over elegance, quantity over perfection. Aircraft could be assembled quickly, repaired in the field, and replaced without ceremony. Engines were shipped in crates. Spare parts arrived in volume. The sound of machinery, factories running through the night, shipyards hammering steel, became a recurring presence, an audible symbol of continuity. Where Axis production slowed under bombardment and scarcity, Allied output adapted, dispersed, and accelerated. Leadership choices amplified these differences. In authoritarian systems, information flowed upward selectively. Failures were concealed. Reality was softened. Decisions were made to preserve authority, rather than adjust to conditions. Orders remained absolute even as circumstances changed. This rigidity carried a cost measured in lives. Entire units were held in place long after withdrawal was rational. Cities were declared fortresses and left to starve. The horsemen of death did not need to force entry. It was invited by inflexibility. Allied leadership operated under pressure of a different kind. Democracies required explanation. Losses were reported. Failures were debated. The process was slower, sometimes clumsy but adaptive. Strategies changed. Commanders were replaced. Resources were reallocated. This responsiveness did not eliminate suffering, but it altered its trajectory. Mistakes became data rather than doctrine. From a moral angle, the war exposed a divide between what was promised and what was delivered. Totalitarian systems had promised order, security, and national rebirth. What they delivered was hunger, displacement, and an ever-widening circle of death. Soldiers began to recognize the discrepancy not through philosophical reflection, but through physical experience. Empty bowls carried more weight than slogans. Silence in bombed cities spoke louder than speeches. Across prison camps, battlefields, and ruined towns, small details repeated themselves. A tin of preserved meat, a piece of chocolate, the steady hum of a generator. These were not gestures of mercy. They were byproduct of a system that could sustain itself while fighting. Over time, these details accumulated into meaning. They suggested that power was not merely the ability to destroy, but the capacity to maintain life amid destruction. By late 1944, these realizations converged. The angles of technology, leadership, and morality no longer pointed in different directions. They aligned toward a single moment, where endurance would confront collapse, and where the four horsemen would ride together into a final, decisive passage. By December 1944, the war had compressed into a series of final gambles. In the West, German forces launched one last major offensive through the Ardennes, a region of forests and frozen roads chosen for its perceived weakness. Snow fell steadily. Fuel was scarce. Units moved at night to conserve what little they had. The plan depended on speed, surprise, and a hope that Allied logistics could be disrupted long enough to fracture resolve. For a brief moment, the front bent. Maps shifted. Headlines tightened. But the conditions that had carried the Reich to early victories were gone. Tanks advanced only as far as their fuel allowed. Artillery paused for lack of shells. Encircled units waited for supplies that never arrived. When the skies cleared, Allied aircraft returned in overwhelming numbers. Roads clogged with destroyed vehicles. The offensive slowed, then stalled, then dissolved. What remained were exhausted men, retreating through terrain already stripped of shelter and food. The horsemen of war had arrived with force, but it found no strength left to sustain it. In the east, the scale was even larger. In January 1945, the Red Army launched a massive offensive from the Vistula River. Entire German formations collapsed within days. Cities that had prepared for prolonged defense were bypassed or overrun. Civilians fled westward in freezing conditions, carrying what they could on carts and sleds. Disease spread through refugee columns. Frostbite claimed limbs before bullets did. The movement itself became lethal. Pestilence and death traveled together unopposed. As Allied forces advanced into the heart of Europe, they encountered the physical evidence of ideology made operational. Camps appeared on maps as administrative locations. On the ground, they were fields of starvation and disease. Survivors were skeletal, weakened beyond speech. Medical teams documented conditions with clinical precision, average weights, mortality rates, causes of death. These records were not created for drama. They were created because the scale demanded accounting. Famine had been organized. Death had been processed. In the Pacific, the pattern repeated differently, but no less severely. On islands cut off by naval blockade, Japanese garrisons consumed their own seed stock. Malaria and dysentery spread unchecked. Ammunition ran low. Orders remained absolute. Surrender was rarely authorized. Death became cumulative rather than sudden. The absence of food did what bombardment could not. Entire units faded from operational relevance, not through defeat, but through depletion. Against this backdrop, American supply lines continued to function. Cargo ships arrived in sequence. Field kitchens operated near the front. Medical evacuation followed established routes. These systems did not eliminate fear or loss, but they imposed structure on chaos. To those witnessing the contrast, enemy soldiers, liberated civilians, displaced populations, the difference was unmistakable. The horsemen had not spared the Allies, but they had not consumed them in the same way. By the spring of 1945, the outcome was no longer in question. What remained was a reckoning. The war's decisive moment was not a single battle or surrender. It was a realization, spreading quietly across ruined landscapes, that some systems collapsed under total strain, while others endured, and that endurance itself had become the final weapon. As the front lines closed in from every direction, collapse accelerated not with chaos, but with exhaustion. In Germany, transportation networks failed first. Rail lines lay twisted beneath bomb junctions. Coal stockpiles dwindled. Power stations shut down in sequence. Factories stood intact but silent, their machines useless without electricity or raw material. Production targets continued to be issued, even as the means to meet them disappeared. The machinery of command outlived the reality it governed. Cities emptied unevenly. Some civilians fled early. Others remained, bound by age, duty, or disbelief. In Berlin, food rations fell again in March 1945. Bread was stretched with fillers. Meat vanished entirely. Hospitals overflowed, then darkened as power failed. Disease followed the breakdown of sanitation. The horsemen no longer needed battlefields. They moved through basements, shelters, and hospital wards. For soldiers still fighting, perception narrowed to immediate needs: ammunition, shelter, warmth. Many no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of reaching the next village, the next meal, the next night. Prisoners taken during these weeks often appeared, relieved rather than defeated. Allied reports noted a striking absence of resistance in some areas, not from mercy, but from depletion. Hunger had done what firepower could not. In occupied territories, liberation arrived unevenly and with shock. Civilians emerged from hiding to confront armies that were not starving. Field kitchens appeared within hours. Bread was issued in controlled quantities to prevent medical collapse. The act of eating became dangerous for those long deprived. Medical officers documented refeeding syndrome with careful attention. Even abundance required discipline. The symbolism was unmistakable. Power now lay not in destruction, but in restraint and organization. Across camps and prisons, records were seized, cataloged, and preserved. Numbers replaced rumors. Mortality rates were calculated. Supply requisitions were traced. The administrative nature of mass death became undeniable. It had been planned, resourced, and executed within bureaucratic frameworks. The horseman of death was not abstract. It had formed signatures and stamps. In the Pacific, the final months followed a similar arc. Cities burned. Supply lines vanished. Civilians were drawn into the war's final convulsions. Yet even here, contrast persisted. American forces distributed food and medical aid alongside combat operations. These actions were not purely humanitarian gestures. They were strategic, stabilizing populations to prevent further collapse. Still, to those receiving aid, the meaning extended beyond strategy. It suggested a different relationship between power and life. By the time surrender came, it arrived into landscapes already transformed. The four horsemen had completed their passage. War had stripped illusion. Famine had exposed policy. Pestilence had revealed neglect. Death had rendered verdicts no ideology could overturn. What remained was not triumph, but consequence, and the task of living in a world that had seen too much to return unchanged. The aftermath did not begin with celebration. It began with accounting. Across Europe and Asia, the war left behind not only ruins, but millions of unanswered questions that demanded structure. Governments compiled casualty lists that could never be complete. Cities measured destruction in percentages rather than streets. Rail networks counted bridges rather than destinations. The scale resisted comprehension, but it required documentation all the same. In Germany alone, an estimated 7 million civilians were dead or missing by war's end. Urban centers lay in fields of rubble. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne. Names reduced to coordinates and tonnage in post-war reports. Food production collapsed. In some regions, harvest reached barely half of pre-war levels. Daily caloric intake remained below survival thresholds well into 1946. Famine did not end with surrender. It lingered, sustained by shattered infrastructure and displaced populations moving across borders in the millions. Eastern Europe bore an even heavier burden. Entire villages had vanished. Agricultural land lay mined or scorched. The Soviet Union reported losses exceeding 20 million, military and civilian combined. Disease followed displacement. Typhus outbreaks spread through refugee camps. Medical services struggled to keep pace. The horsemen of pestilence remained long after the guns fell silent, thriving in the vacuum left by collapsed systems. In Asia, the destruction was no less severe. Japanese cities burned extensively under aerial bombardment. Industrial output fell to a fraction of pre-war capacity. Food shortages intensified. The government relied on emergency imports to prevent mass starvation. In China, years of occupation and internal conflict had hollowed out entire regions. Malnutrition was widespread. The war's end did not restore abundance. It merely halted further descent. Against this backdrop, the movement of American aid reshaped the immediate post-war landscape. Food shipments, medical supplies, and logistical expertise crossed oceans in quantities previously reserved for war material. In Europe, ration levels began to stabilize only when external support arrived. In Japan, emergency relief prevented a humanitarian catastrophe. These efforts were documented, debated, and sometimes resented, but their impact was measurable. Survival rates improved. Disease receded. Time was bought. The contrast left an impression that outlasted relief itself. Former enemy populations experienced, often for the first time, a system that prioritized restoration over extraction. This did not erase memory or responsibility. It altered perception. The experience of receiving aid from a former adversary complicated narratives of enmity. It suggested that power, once stripped of ideological armor, could be directed toward reconstruction as effectively as destruction. These realities did not resolve the war's moral weight. They deepened it. The four horsemen had passed, but their traces remained embedded in landscapes and institutions. Understanding what followed required confronting not only what had been lost, but what choices had made such loss possible. As Reconstruction began, the war's consequences reshaped global thinking with a force equal to the conflict itself. The physical damage was immense, but the psychological shift ran deeper. Nations no longer debated whether total war could occur. They debated whether civilization could survive it again. The numbers forced a question. More than 60 million dead. Entire generations thinned. Cities rebuilt not as they had been, but as they could be afforded. In Europe, recovery depended on coordination rather than isolation. Borders still existed, but scarcity ignored them. Food, coal, and raw materials moved according to need, not conquest. The introduction of large-scale recovery programs stabilized economies and reduced the immediate threat of famine. Rationing continued, but predictably. Bread was still measured, but it arrived. The sound of factories returned, no longer devoted to armaments alone. Production shifted toward repair, housing, and civilian life. Germany and Japan faced transformations imposed from outside, but shaped internally. Military structures were dismantled. Educational systems were revised. Former doctrines were examined publicly and critically. This process was uneven and often resisted, but it reflected a lesson learned through experience rather than instruction. Ideology had promised protection and delivered ruin. Abundance, once dismissed as decadence, had proven essential to resilience. The United States emerged not untouched, but fundamentally altered in its role. It had mobilized its economy, its population, and its values at unprecedented scale. The war demonstrated that democratic systems, though slow to engage, could sustain prolonged conflict without collapsing into famine or disease. This capacity became part of global perception. Influence was no longer measured solely by territory held or armies fielded. but by the ability to stabilize regions, supply populations, and rebuild systems. Across former battlefields, memory took physical form. Cemeteries stretched across quiet fields. Memorials rose in city centers. Archives filled with documents, photographs, and testimonies. These were not only records of loss, they were warnings. The Four Horsemen were not supernatural forces. They were outcomes, produced when policy ignored consequence, when power severed itself from responsibility. For those who had lived through starvation, displacement, and survival, the lesson was simpler and more immediate. Systems mattered. Food mattered. Care mattered. The sound of machinery producing bread instead of bombs mattered. These details, once mundane, had become measures of freedom itself. The world that emerged was neither innocent nor secure, but it was aware, and that awareness, hard-earned and incomplete, would shape the decades that followed, carrying forward a memory of what had been revealed when the Four Horsemen rode, without restraint. In the quiet that followed, the world began to understand what had been unleashed and what had endured. The Four Horsemen had passed not as myths, but as measured realities: war, famine, pestilence, and death, each riding in tandem across continents, leaving destruction, suffering, and revelation in their wake. Yet even amid ruins, the human capacity for organization, endurance, and renewal became apparent. Where ideology failed to sustain life, systems built on abundance and care preserved it. Bread, once a simple necessity, had emerged as a symbol of survival and civilization. The same wheat that nourished soldiers and civilians alike represented the moral weight of responsibility. That power untempered by foresight or compassion produces catastrophe, while abundance, when guided by planning and discipline, sustains it. Soldiers liberated from starving camps, civilians emerging from besieged cities, and nations rebuilt from rubble all encountered this lesson in tangible form. The measure of freedom, it seemed, was not the absence of threat, but the presence of life's continuity. And so the Four Horsemen did not leave only death behind. They left recognition that the endurance of humanity is inseparable from the care we provide one another, that survival is more than a tally of victories, that abundance, when shared wisely, becomes a quiet testament to the ideals we claim to defend. The world had glimpsed apocalypse, and in that glimpse, it learned its own fragility and its own promise. The snow of January 1945, the silence of ruined villages, the hum of machinery producing bread instead of bombs, all became a memory, a reminder, a symbol, that even in the darkest winter, the capacity to sustain life defines what it truly means to endure.